Hi, Ron Joseph, born in 1952, raised in the small central Maine town of Oakland, Maine. But I was really greatly influenced to go into a career about wildlife. I'm a retired wildlife biologist now, by spending time on my grandparents' dairy farm when I was a kid. It was a beautiful 105-acre dairy farm, and for a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, it was heaven. We had chores. My grandparents had no electricity, no running water, and I can remember they had a well in the back, and it was with the windlass, and you lower the bucket into the well. My brother and I, my twin brother and I, were 5 years old. It was cranking the wheel to get the water up, and my grandfather would go slow and steady, because you hit the walls of the well, you lose a lot of water. So it was just a magical time to grow up on a farm, and we had chores, mostly shoveling cow manure. But as a kid, you still have plenty of time to play, and with no electricity, you got to entertain yourself. So we chased foxes and pups in the field, and my grandfather had a team of workhorses. He had no equipment, no motorized equipment, and he had these team of workhorses with a sickle bar mower, and he'd cut the hay. And I don't think there's a prettier sight than watching foxes and fox pups chasing behind the sickle mower, because when the hay gets cut, you've got mice and voles running around, and this mother fox was teaching her pups how to catch these voles. So it was really a magical time on the farm. And I can remember my first moose. It was probably 1958, 59. I was 5 or 6 years old. And we had this border collie, Bonnie was her name. We had a whole series of dogs. So they had sheep as well, dairy cows, 15 or 16 dairy cows. And I looked in the pasture, and it looked like my grandfather's workhorses had these boards on his head. And it was a bull moose. And the border collie got behind the moose, chased it into the barnyard, and as the Cape farmhouse, and then there's the barn, and between the two, she had a clothesline hanging up, and she just got done washing clothes. So you got sheets, my grandfather's union suit waving in the wind, and this poor moose got nowhere to go. And Bonnie chases the moose through the dooryard, and it ducks underneath the clothesline, and it comes out the other side with my grandmother's bra hung on his antlers. Because we're laughing like crazy. And the moose is going across, pell-mell across the hayfield with this bra, my grandmother's bra dangling from an antler. And my grandmother comes out. She's got gum rubber boots on and a broom, and she's running after the moose, waving the broom. And then about a month later, we're out there with my grandfather. He's chopping down a great big pine tree. And he's got his team of workhorses to twitch the log out. And there's the bra. It's hung up on a witch hazel, It's been out there for a month or two. So, it was just a wonderful time. And I knew as a young kid, I always had an interest in the outdoors. And if you're in Maine, in rural Maine, you develop an interest in hunting, and I did. Partridge and deer, mostly up on the farm. But then I had an uncle, Uncle Ernal, who had a Winchester 30-30. Which is what they used in the Rifleman, the old TV series, lever action. Well, he taught me how to use it and let me borrow it. And I can remember, I think I was in the 8th grade, so that would have been about 1964 or thereabout, 65. And kids can't do this today, but it was pretty common back in the 60s for rural Maine kids to hunt on the way to school during deer season. And I would carry that Winchester 30-30 to school. Never shot a deer. I was thinking about what they have done with it. But the rule was you got to school and you emptied the rifle on the football field, and you carried the rifle either to put it in older friend's vehicle, store it for the day, or you take it into the principal's office. Well, I did. Occasionally my brother Bobby would drive to school and I could put it in there, but more often than not, I took it into the principal's office, and he stored it in the closet, along with probably 4 or 5 other kids. And then one day, I'm in study hall, first thing in the morning, and the principal comes in with Oral Page, who was a game warden. His daughter, by the way, Mimi, was in my class. And they lived in a beautiful old stone farmhouse on the Belgrade Road. And the principal came in with the game warden, Oral Page, and I could see him whispering to the teacher up front, and then they called my name, and I think it was David Burwood and 2 other boys, all hunters, and called us to the front of the room and to step out. And these kids are going, yeah, you're in trouble now. So we step out in the hallway, and Oral Page explains why he's there, and that is the bull moose got struck and killed by a train right near the school property, and he was willing to donate the moose meat to the school if 4 kids could help him butcher it. So we spent the day butchering the moose and quartering it, and we took it over to Leo Michu's market on Maine Street. The warden had made arrangements with Mr. Michu ahead of time to use his industrial meat grinder. So we got there, and there's piles and piles of beef and pork suet to mix, because moose meat is pretty lean. So we mixed it, and we ended up probably about mid-afternoon with about 500 pounds of moose hamburger in these 10-pound packages. And then Mr. Whitney showed up, the principal, later in the day at the store with his station wagon. We loaded up in the station wagon, and by that time they had cleared out a freezer at the school. So I remember Tuesdays was sloppy joes with moose meat, and Fridays was chop suey with moose meat. And as you walk into the cafeteria, it was down in the basement, and had a blackboard, and it announced what was the menu for the day. And it said sloppy joes with moose meat, and somebody had taken probably their shirt sleeve and erased an O in moose and put a U. So it was sloppy joes with mouse meat. And that went undetected for a while, but it was funny. But we felt pretty proud, the 4 of us, that we had, taken a tragedy and turned it into a, bonanza, food bonanza. And again, you couldn't do that today. It's not USDA inspected. You can't carry a gun to school anymore for obvious reasons, but it never occurred to us that, we'd never turn a gun on a classmate or a teacher. And I'm thinking about this, looking back, the world's so changed, because every kid I knew had pocket knives. We all had pocket knives, and can't take a knife to school anymore. But a lot of us kids, after school, worked at a dairy farm, and you needed a pocket knife for severing, baling twine on a bale of hay, where you feed the cows or you put bedding down in the stalls. But no more. There's no more. You can't carry a knife anymore in school. Yeah, times have changed. I can remember talking to my friend Greg Drummond. He had a principal in Sydney that would pick the kids up, Brandon Matheson, during deer season, pick them up, probably an hour and a half before school started, and take them hunting on the school grounds. and then they'd leave their guns in Mr. Matheson's vehicle and go to 10 class. Just being time on the farm, I knew I wanted to become a wildlife biologist, and I did. So I went to the University of New Hampshire, graduated in 1974 with a BS degree in wildlife management. Took a year off, taught school in Oakland for 1 year, science, because I didn't want any debt. And I had $1,200 in student loan debt, so I paid it off. And then I went to grad school at BYU in Utah and studied eagles. Because I had a great professor in college. His name was Dr. Art Borer, undergraduate. And you talk about how one professor can make a big difference in a kid's life. I was on probation my freshman year, second sophomore freshman year, and first semester sophomore year. I didn't know how to study, and I was getting ready to get kicked out. But I took ornithology my second semester sophomore year. And Dr. Art Borer was the instructor, study of birds. And I loved the class. And he took an interest in me, and I got an A. And he gave me a big compliment because he made me his lab assistant, which is usually reserved for graduate students. So I found a calling, you know, because he really turned me around. And had I not taken his class, I'm sure I would have flunked out. So he sat me down my senior year and said, "What do you want to do? You want to study birds?" He says, "You've got a real aptitude in that." I says, "Yeah, I want to study hawks and eagles." He said, "Well, I got two choices, Cornell University or Brigham Young University in the West." He said, "Those are the two best schools for studying raptors." I said, "I want to go out west. I want to see the West." I'd never been west. So I ended up at Provo, Utah, and did my master's degree on bald eagles and golden eagles. And it was a great experience. And I finished up in 1977. Came back to Maine, because being a Maine kid, you know, I really wanted to get back to Maine, and just did a bunch of odd jobs, chopping wood, cutting pulpwood with Greg Drummond and Ronnie Stevens, and substitute teaching. And then I just waited for a job opening, and then Maine Fish and Wildlife hired me in January of 1978. I applied for a temporary position. And I was the third choice. They had interviewed a bunch of kids. I was the third choice, but the other two said, "Where's the job?" And I said, "It's in Ashland." I had a big map of the state of Maine and pointed to Ashland. And these two kids said, "We're not going up there." I'll go up there. You know, it was a foot in the door, and you know, you got to take advantage of that, and I did, and it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. I'd never been to Ashland. It's a long drive up to Aroostook County in the wintertime. So I got to Ashland. It's late January 1978, probably about 30 below. And I borrowed my mother's car. Didn't even have a car. And Kevin Stevens, bless his heart, he was my supervisor. He gave me a one or 2 day of orientation. He said, "You're going to be doing deer yards." He said, "I've made arrangements for you to stay at Clayton Lake, which is a international paper company logging camp, 65 miles west of Ashland." And it was spectacular. I lived with French-Canadian lumberjacks. I was the only English-speaking fellow. Here I am in Maine. I'm the only English speaker at the dinner table, and all these French-Canadians, you know, the Quebecois. And we managed to communicate. There were English speakers there. Bill Sylvester was the supervisor, but he had his own cabin. And then there were two foresters, Peter Farnsworth and his family, and Steve Weeder and his young family. But they had their own living quarters. But in the main cabin, where the dining room was, and up above was the bunkhouse, I was the only English speaker there. And it was great. It was great. Their English was much better than my French, but it was funny talking to them. "Throw me over the salt shaker, please," you know. Toss me down the stairs in my slippers, you know. But it was, yeah, I loved it. And I got to fly with a great Maine game warden pilot named Jack McPhee. And John McPhee, the great writer, Coming Into the Country, those books he's written, he wrote a piece about his namesake, John McPhee. He always wanted to meet this game warden in Maine, this famous game warden. And he wrote a piece in the New Yorker in 1984. John McPhee meets John McPhee, the game warden. And I highly recommend it for people who haven't read it. It's a beautiful piece about this game warden. And I say in past tense because he was a warden pilot, but he died in a plane crash in 2003. But he was one of the nicest. It was just a treasure to be with around Jack. He was as interested in wildlife biology as he was law enforcement. And I can remember he picked me up at Clayton Lake in the middle of the winter, landed on the lake with his skis. He had a Super Cub, and he picked me up because I wanted to go to the Big Black River. It was a really large deer wintering area on the Big Black River, which is a tributary of the St. John, way up in northern Maine. And I wanted to get a layout of where the deer yard was. So I had a topo sheet. He picked me up. We took off from Clayton Lake in early February one morning and flew up over there. And to see that land then, the big woods, it was really big woods then. It was before the budworm epidemic had really devastated the forest and before large-scale clear-cutting took place. It was the end of an era, and I was very much aware of that it was the end of a logging era. That in the 80s, they had to salvage these damaged trees, these budworm damaged trees, and there's really a lot of clear cuts now. But back then it was huge, huge forests as far as you could see, and it was a magical winter for me up there. I'd walk 5 to 10 miles a day on snowshoes, and it was one forester, Peter Farnsworth. He was a great guy. Still stay in touch with him. He lives up in Eustis now. They were a little concerned about me because I was young, and so he would go with me on these excursions at first because he didn't want me to get lost. You get lost up there in the middle of the winter, you're in trouble. And every day we'd stop at noon, have our lunch, and he'd make 3 boiled tea, and he'd light a dead white birch. There's 3 feet of snow on the ground, and he'd find a dead white birch, and if you've ever lit a dead white birch, it's really something that it goes up in a torch. It's just instant heat. So he'd a roaring tree, and we'd sit on our snowshoes and have lunch, and he'd boil some. He'd pack his little teapot full of snow and boil it, and then throw a tea bag in there and put it over the fire 3 times so it boiled 3 times. They really like strong tea, and we'd have tea, And I'd lean up against a dead tree. And I don't know, one time I'm eating my lunch, and I felt something land on me, and I look up, and there's right above my head is a family of flying squirrels, northern flying squirrels. It's just, and to see a moose, cow moose, walk in front of you in 3 feet of snow. I'm on snowshoes, and right behind her the calf, walking in the same footprints. Yeah, when April came that year, April of '87, I didn't want to leave Clayton Lake. It was just a wonderful community, really tight-knit community with the French Canadians and then the American workers. But the snows disappeared in late April, and my job was over, so they sent me down to Augusta. So it was kind of culture shock going from the big woods all the way down to the city in Augusta, where I had a job with Maine Fish and Wildlife, another temporary position. It was April. Snows have already disappeared there, and Gene Dumont was my supervisor, and he said, well, we're going to be counting deer dung because we need to figure out how many deer per square mile there are. And we're not the only ones to do it. There's biologists all around the state in April trying to figure out how many deer there are per square mile. But he says, but we got to do a little training here at the office. He says, there's a little woods behind the office building, and I want you to go out there, and I want to show you how we do this. It was like a hula hoop object. You walk, it was a random route, straight line, compass bearing. You just throw the hoop down, and you count the number of deer droppings there are in there. So we get out there, and Gene's counting these droppings, and we got the data sheets, and we go to the next one, and he said, now look at these on the ground. He says, they're real glossy. He says, that means they're fresh. He says, because they haven't had a chance to dry yet. There's a little brown, well, people have seen deer droppings. And he picks them up. And he puts them in his hands, and he's smelling them, and he says, yep. He says, fresh. And he pops them in his mouth, and I'm appalled. It's like, what are you doing? He says, well, actually, these are chocolate-covered raisins. He says, the lesson here is don't assume what you're looking at is deer, because we're going to run into sheep droppings, we're going to run into goat droppings on these surveys. So you want to be looking over these real close. Gene had a really good sense of humor, so he was trying to tell me a little lesson that don't just assume that it is, because it could be anything else. So the next day, after our little orientation about how to do these surveys, he gave me a map and had a bearing on it. It was a mile-long transect. And he says, stick with the bearing. We're in Jefferson, town of Jefferson, just outside of Augusta. He says, you're going to walk this, and every 100 feet, you're going to throw this hula hoop-like object and count the deer droppings. Well, I got it. My topo sheet is 1958. This is 1978. It's the newest topo sheet they had. So I'm walking the bearing, and Gene's last instructions to me, he was on another route up to about 2,000 feet away. He said, stay on the compass bearing, because if you deviate, it's going to throw a wrench into the statistics. So all right, so I'm staying on the compass bearing and throwing the hoop. And then I'm making note, because there's a lot of land use changes in 20 years. You know, there's a clearing where there wasn't on the map. Because the map there shows green, and that means forest, but there's a lot of clearings where there's no forest. So about halfway through, I can hear music. This is strange up ahead. It was a beautiful April day, and I come up to this clearing, and there's a house where it shouldn't be, or it's at least not on the map, and there's a young woman in the back sunbathing, and she's right and directly in line with my compass bearing. And she's sunbathing nude. So I think, geez, you know, I retreated about 100 feet thinking, how am I going to handle this? I could go around and then violate what Gene told me to do, is to stay on the compass bearing. Or I could try to, she was playing this, of all things, it was a Beatles song. With a little luck, we can make this whole damn thing work out. I'm thinking, hey, this isn't going to work out for me. I think I could sneak around her, but I said, no. So I decided to yell at Jean, thinking she might hear that, and she did, thankfully. She heard it, she jumped up and then ran into the house. And then I stayed on my compass bearing, and I go by there, and there's this I'll never forget, it was a Jaws poster, a beach towel. And it was all curled up, and the eye of the shark was just looking right at me, you know, staring. And then I can see, I didn't look at the house. She's upstairs in the bedroom. I can feel her eyes just boring a hole into me. And I'm just standing there, compass bearing, and just praying for this thing to end. And I get to the end of the transect, which was where my truck was. And there's a sheriff's vehicle. She'd called the sheriffs, you know. And I said, I can explain everything. I can explain. I had a patch, you know, fish and game patch on. I had all my data sheets. I said, it was a deer. I'm doing deer yard work, and these are my deer dung data sheets. And he says, keep explaining, and I did. And he said, oh, I'm gonna go tell her what happened. He said, he said, anything you want to tell her? I said, yeah, apologize. I said, but tell her her house wasn't on my map, so I couldn't leave the compass bearing. So, I did walk back 100 feet, so I'd give her a chance to, you know, get up and leave without seeing her. Yeah, I thought I was in deep trouble then, but yeah. Funny things happen, you know, you never know. Field work is always something going to throw a wrench into things. So in 1988, I accepted a job, full-time position as a regional wildlife biologist in Moosehead Lake in Greenville. And I think it was January of '88 I arrived. And I can remember my first day on the job. Moosehead's this huge lake. It's 40 miles long. And the office was at the south end of the lake. And wintertime, there's nothing stopping that wind coming down the lake. It's a cold, cold spot. So I get to the office, and I'm unpacking my boxes, boxes of books. And Charlie Marshall comes in. He's a game warden. Turns out he's my neighbor in Shirley. I had bought a house in Shirley, just south of Greenville. He says, Ron, how'd you like to go for a plane ride? See part of the region you're in? And he said, I got to dispatch a moose that's up at the north end of the lake. I said, what's the matter with the moose? It's got brainworm. He said, and ice fishermen this past weekend were telling us about this moose with brainworm. And brainworm is lethal to moose. You know, they get really sick, and they walk around in a circle, and it's a horrible sight. And they die eventually, a slow death. He says, yeah, I'm gonna fly up. I've got a warden pilot here. He's gonna fly me up. He says, why don't you come with us? I said, sure. So I put down my boxes of books and button up my coat and wool pants and grab my snowshoes and hop into the plane with Charlie Marshall and a warden pilot. I can't remember his name. But it doesn't matter. So we fly at the north end of the lake, and we land right near an island. I don't remember which island it was. And Casey LaCase is there. He's a well-known trapper, outdoorsman in Greenville, a real character. He owns Tracy's Casey Spencer Bay camps for many years. Anyway, Casey's there with his snowmobile, and he'd done some reconnaissance for us before we got there. He said he knew Charlie real well. He said, Charlie, the moose is on the backside of this little island. So Charlie grabs his rifle, and we go around the other side of the island, and sure enough, that poor moose is just really sick. So he shoots the moose, and I can remember Casey says, do you mind if I use it for bait, for coyote bait? Because he liked to hunt coyotes. I said, no, take it. Go ahead, take it. He said, well, when you guys fly back, he says, you might want to veer over towards Kineo. He said, there's quite a site there. He says, they're harvesting logs off from Deer Island, which is about a mile from the mainland. He says, but they've got quite an operation there. He says, they're pumping water up onto the lake to make an ice causeway. He said, and the moose come across there late afternoon, sometimes in the morning, he said, to feed on the tops of the trees that they're cutting. Now these are really big logging trucks, and probably 40 tons, 80,000 pounds when they're fully loaded. And so we make the tour over towards Kineo and head towards Deer Island anyway, and there is these huge water pumps. They drilled a hole in 3 feet of ice, and they got a line of these water pumps shooting jets of steam up onto the ice. And it's built up about 8 or 10 feet. And these logging trucks, fully loaded, are crossing from Deer Island over the lake. And sure enough, we see this moose. I can't remember if it was going to the island or I think probably going to the island. And it's coated in this mist or water that's coming out of the lake, and it's just sparkling. It's beautiful, freezing on this coat just as soon as it arrives. It's like diamonds. It was this handsome bull moose, And then he said later in the day, Casey said, when the logging operation stopped, he says the moose come out in droves to feed on the tops because the trees get knocked down or cut down, and they only want the logs, of course. But the limbs, the tops of the limbs, is what the moose are after. So I said, this is something people don't get to see every day, is to see a man-made ice causeway to handle 80,000 pound loaded logging trucks going across the lake. That was a remarkable sight. You almost things like you can't believe that it would be possible to do that, but it was. Greenville was a great experience for me. I really loved working there. Great people. Got to meet some real characters, and I can remember later in the spring that year, '88, this woman came into the office, and she's got this blanket, and I can hear a baby crying in the blanket, and it turns out it was a bear cub. And her husband was a logger. She was crying, and she said, my husband feels terrible. I said, what happened? She said, well, his skidder backed up onto a bear den. Of course, he wouldn't have known because it was covered in snow. Like if you can picture a beaver dam in the wintertime covered in snow. Well, the skidder backed up, and the skidders are a pretty heavy machine. He backed up onto this bear den mound. He didn't know it was a bear den. And he actually accidentally killed the mother sow bear and a cub. So he went back the next day when he started the skidder up, he could hear a baby crying. And he got digging around, and he found this where he accidentally killed this mother and the cub. And he grabbed this surviving cub, called his wife, and then she came and picked it up at, I think it was some store, and she brought it to the office. And she was pretty upset about it. And it was in bad shape, this cub. And I called Martin French down in Dover Foxcroft. He was a well-known wildlife rehabilitator, he and his wife. I said, Martin, I'm coming down with the bear cub. He says, bring it down. So I put this poor bear cub in a box, cardboard box, in my state truck. And I'm headed down towards Dover Foxcroft, and I'm in town, and there's a red light, about one red light in town. So I'm stopped at the stoplight, and a school bus pulls up beside me, right up beside me, and the cub is sticking his head out of the box, and he's got his nose up against the window, and I can hear all these kids in the school bus giggling and screaming, all pointing down at the bear cub. So the bus takes off, and I head down to Martin's, and I said, geez, cubs, I can't let this cub get out and walk around in the cab, you know. So I just had a little mitten, I just tapped him on the nose, and he got right back into the box. So I took him to Martin, dropped him off. Martin said, hey, these things are tough. He said, he's in bad shape. He said, but I think we can get him. So he's okay. Well, 2 weeks later, Martin says, you've got to come get this cub. He said, he's eating me out of house and home, and he is tearing everything apart. He's gained about 10 pounds, and he's ready to go back into the wild. So I called the bear biologist, Randy Cross in Bangor. I said, Randy, we got this orphan cub. Have you got a sow that can take it? He had a sow in bear in LaGrange that was well known for accepting orphan cubs. And so we went there that day, and we dropped this. He went in, I was with him, but this cub that we had, it had a little white on its chest. They usually don't have a lot of, excuse me, on the crest. I got it backwards. A little white on the back on the nape, and which is really unusual marking. And so he took the cub and he snuck up to the den and just lowered it into the den, and she was awake, but she just grabbed the cub and pulled it in nearer with her other ones. And we know it survived because Randy would check every once in a while, and that cub made it. And then years later, I saw the cub as an adult. It was amazing. It survived because it had this white, very unusual white marking on the back of the neck, and it was teaching it was a she, and she was teaching her cubs how to excavate snapping turtle eggs. I was doing some work for the Penobscot Indian Nation, and I was in this big platform, wildlife observation platform, and I could see her walking down this gravel road and digging out these snapping turtle eggs, and then her young would come running behind and eat the eggs. So he was teaching them how to do it. And it was the same cub that I'd rescued years earlier, same bear I should say, I had rescued years earlier as a cub. And I've been retired now for almost 10 years, but I still stay active as a wildlife professional. I volunteer. I want to give back, so I volunteer a lot with land trusts, especially I'm on the advisory board of the Kennebec Land Trust, and each year they hire a bunch of summer interns. These are college students that are pretty much interested in wildlife or ecology, and they have these programs for them, and they have me come down and spend some time with them to help identify trees, help identify birds, because they do these surveys. So it's sort of my way of giving back. And I do the same thing with Coastal Mountain Land Trust down. So I like to give myself some time with the young people, because that's the next generation that's going to take over what my older generation has set up in terms of ecological studies and making contribution to the planet. So I feel good about that. It's funny because my experiences in Greenville, Everett Parker, he and his wife owned Moosehead Messenger, and he encouraged me. He says, you've got some great stories. Why don't you write a weekly column for us? We'll pay you $25 a week. So I started a weekly column. I had no idea, and people really liked it. Just it was stuff that I had seen, like the bear cub story or the moose check station. And people really enjoyed it, and then it got picked up. Some of my stories got picked up by the Bangor Daily News. And there was one story, I wrote a piece about old growth forests, and Down East Magazine read it. It was in the Bangor Daily News, and they ran it in the magazine. So I got it in with Down East Magazine. So I said, well, people apparently like what I'm writing, so I continued to write. I went to a workshop, the Iowa Writers Workshop in Iowa. It was a famous workshop, and so I applied and got in there and sort of honed my skills. I'm going to write. I want to do a better job. So make a long story short, people have encouraged me to take all of my collection of writings that I've had since 1988 in Moosehead Messenger, Bangor Daily News, Down East Magazine, Maine Boats, Homes and Harbors, Penn Bay Pilot, and consolidate it in a book. And I made a pitch last year to Islandport Press, and Yarmouth, and they said they liked it. So I've got a book coming out, and I think it's going to be in July. The book will be about. It's just a collection of all my stories, farm life, what it was like growing up on a farm, and then my wildlife stories, working with lynx, working with eagles. So we'll see how that goes. Well, when I started working as a fish and wildlife biologist in 1978, one of the first jobs I had was obviously doing deer work, but I also got a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovering bald eagles. And to give you an idea of how far we've come, people often ask me, what are things like today versus back then? And in some it's a mixed bag. In some respects, for some species, it's much better. For a lot of other species, like songbirds, it's very dire. We've lost a lot of our songbirds. They're diminishing to a great extent. But bald eagles is one really big success story. And in 1978, when I started working on eagles in Maine, there was like 24 pairs. That was it. Today we've got over 800 pairs of eagles in the state. I mean, it's hard to go anywhere without seeing an eagle. So that is and that's nationally, not just Maine. That's a really big success story. And the other success story is peregrines. They were extirpated from Maine in 1962. I got a chance to work on the peregrine recovery program here and in the West. That was a pretty big highlight of my career. And now we've got probably 20 pairs of peregrines in the state. I think they're nesting on bridges here in South Portland. They used to nest on a bank building here in Portland as well. So that's a really good success story. But there are some other dire stories, and of course I specialized in songbirds, and they've decreased by a phenomenal degree. So mixed bag. The water quality certainly is a great deal better now than when I grew up on the Kennebec. It was really highly polluted, and now it's very clean. Dams have been removed. Edwards Dam. We got 3 million alewives running up the Sebastopol River, and bringing all those nutrients up from the ocean, and ospreys and eagles feeding on them. So, yeah, we've made some progress, but we got a ways to go too.